Called Jacinda Ardern.
I have to admit, I wasn't really feeling the passion from Mr. McKelvey in that speech. And yet there was a real opportunity there, I felt, that perhaps was missed by the Speaker when he took his chair. He did reach one of his goals, which was giving a 10-minute speech. Beyond that, I'm not sure what was achieved necessarily with that contribution. And you would have thought that the National Party would have been briefed. He can take it in his stride. And I imagine that there's these briefings that go on in the National Party caucus that go something like this. Look, team, we know from Crosby Textor that there's two big issues that we need to hit when times are rough, and the PM's popularity is taking a hit, and that is crime and immigration. It's the go-to. It's the go-to in Australia. In fact, I was not surprised to read that just a year roughly before Tony Abbott took over the lead of Prime Minister in Australia, Mark Textor was writing that, quote, Australians have an uncertain outlook when it comes to their future. They believe the country is facing continuing challenges that directly impact their daily lives, jobs, cost of living, and boat people. I mean, boat people affecting their daily lives. And lo and behold, suddenly, Prime Minister's popularity takes a dive, and what do we see? Him declaring that boat people are on their way to New Zealand. So I honestly, just someone on a boat saying that they're heading to New Zealand is akin to someone saying they're heading to Paris. Just because they said it doesn't mean they're going to get there. And I have to remind this House that boat people have always been saying that they're heading to New Zealand. In fact, under Labour, I recall, that doesn't mean they're going to get here. I recall, because it goes into the two key goals of the National Party, crime and boat people. That's how it's relevant. I recall when Labour was in office, the similar threat. Our concern was that people in Indonesia wanted to head to New Zealand. I'll just finish the sentence. So what did immigration do? They put out a pamphlet saying, if you try that, you will perish. That was the advice then. Now, suddenly, apparently, we need to set up the detention centres because everything's changed. Mr. Speaker, coming back to the crime strategy. The electronic monitoring bill that we have before us tonight does certainly have some things that are worthy of consideration by this House. It does. I will concede that point. The special conditions imposed by a parole board, I have to say that element, the Section 15 amendments, do appear to simply be clarifying a provision of the bill. But the electronic monitoring under the Parole Act 2002, where the bill provides that the offender must comply with written instructions from a probation officer that are reasonably necessary for the effective administration of the electronic monitoring. Instructions might include, for example, requirements that the offender regularly charges the monitoring equipment. Now, when you have a provision that has that much specificity to it, you can assume that there's been some existing issue within current legislation that's required that occur. That's a bit of an indication. So I would be very keen to hear at Select Committee examples where this has been an issue. But how do we ensure, for instance, that an offender is complying with a regime where they are required to keep their electronic monitoring charged? How do you define when the breakdown of equipment, for instance, or the loss of coverage of monitoring is equipment failure? Because we know, anecdotally, we know that there have been issues with equipment failure versus a failure on the part of the offender to recharge said equipment. So that is the level of detail we are required to get into, because if you're going to have further penalties attached to a provision like this, we need to make sure that we're able to differentiate between those two issues. I would also, and just a heads up to the Minister, I'm also very keen for us to explore the effectiveness of the equipment in question. We know that some of the contracting and provision of this equipment has changed. There has been whispers in the street for some time that there have been significant failings, and that this is a contract that's been delivered via 3M, is my understanding. We need to ensure that if we're extending provisions like this, that we have reliability in the technology that we're using. One of the next significant provisions is the pre-sentence reports for sentences of 20 months or intensive supervision. The bill, and I see it states in the Bill Digest, that the bill consequently amends the Sentencing Act 2002, which currently specifically excludes electronic monitoring as a possible special condition for a sentence of intensive supervision. Now, I haven't gone back through the Hansard, and it may not have been raised specifically in the House, but the Ministry of Justice should be aware of why Parliament specifically excluded electronic monitoring from intensive supervision. Parliament will only do that if there is good cause, that if they've given that issue consideration. It might be simply by omission, but to specifically exclude it speaks to something else. So I would be interested to hear more on that, and we'll be raising it at Select Committee. I also want to raise that generally, as my colleague Porter Williams has raised, that electronic monitoring cannot be seen as a substitute for other checks and balances. Now, she rightly used the example of domestic violence and so on, but equally, at the moment, we do have provision for probation officers and the police to have a role in one-to-one contact with offenders, and that has other spin-offs to it. Simply relying on technology to play that role means that we will lose out on that ongoing relationship that we need an offender to play with their probation officer. So I wouldn't want to see those checks reduced, that one-to-one engagement reduced, simply because we have extra conditions that are able to apply for electronic monitoring. But the area I want to spend most of my remaining moments on, Mr. Speaker, is the provisions around offenders sentenced to imprisonment for short terms. At the moment, there is a prohibition on the imposition by the court of an electronic monitoring condition in respect of sentences of less than 24 months, but only in respect of whereabouts condition and not a residential condition. Now, I think it is right that we reconsider that provision because, as has been raised in the House, there are examples perhaps of issues of harassment, of stalking, of domestic violence, where it would be useful to have the ability to put these electronic monitoring conditions in place. My question is, why does the bill not specifically set out a set of relevant offences rather than specify a time frame? Rather than saying 24 months or less, why aren't we being sentence specific, which we do in a lot of other areas, for instance, extended supervision orders and so on. It is not unheard of to say, well, if we're mostly concerned that this is a provision that affects domestic violence situations, why not be specific about that? That might stop it from being overused potentially in the courts if that is indeed a concern. So I'd like to explore that at Select Committee as well. We're also very mindful of the Bill of Rights assessment by the Attorney General, and under that Bora report, this bill fails. But it fails on counts where we've failed before. Extended supervision orders already test the boundaries of the Bill of Rights, and because this relates again to the use of electronic monitoring for extended supervision orders, it's natural that they fail too. But we should never be complacent about Bill of Rights failures in this House, never. It is our obligation to make sure that we truly believe that it is warranted, and that's a test we need to maintain at Select Committee. My final point, Mr. Speaker, is that if some of these provisions are intended to assist with domestic violence situations, for instance, it still relies on a perpetrator entering into the criminal justice system. And yet we know presently that changes in the Crown Prosecution Service guidelines means we are not seeing as many offenders arrested. We're seeing potentially the poor use of police safety orders. And in all of those cases, the flow-on effect is that because funding follows a sentence or a court process or a referral through a court process, we're not necessarily seeing some of those mechanisms being used. This is another mechanism that relies on an offender going through the criminal justice system. So we need to be mindful that that means that we may not be picking up everyone who would potentially benefit from such monitoring in those cases.